Today is a day that is relatively quiet in terms of the battles in Ukraine, or at least news about the battles in Ukraine and about the geopolitical situation, the international affairs situation generally, except, of course, for that frightful conflict in Sudan, which I'm going to come to towards the end of this program. Now, as I've discussed many times about news from Ukrainian battlefields, the lack of news or the lack of information is not necessarily a sign that few things are happening. It's simply a reflection of the fact that we're not getting much information from the various sources which we have to draw upon, Russian and Ukrainian, in order to get a clear view of what is actually going on. The one thing we can say is that there are no great shifts on the battle lines, except, of course, that fighting is continuing to happen, and it is at its most intense in Bakhmut and the Kreminna Svatovo area, and probably around Avdiivka and Marinka and Vugleda. These are the places, the key places, where the major fighting is taking place. And a report from Boris Rozhin, the Russian commentator who writes under the pseudonym of Colonel Kassad, basically says that, in fact, it is in the Bakhmut and Svatovo Kreminna area that the fighting has been most intense, and he describes what is happening in all other places, in all the other places I mentioned, Avdiivka, Marinka, Vugleda, as essentially positional fighting. Kupiansk as well, by the way. But anyway, what Boris Rozhin says about the situation in Bakhmut, and let's start with Bakhmut, can be summarized as follows. And I'm taking this directly from him. There is no cauldron at the moment. The situation of operational encirclement is preserved. The enemy the Ukrainian forces, in other words, are making attempts to push our troops back from the road to the west of Khromovo. Our troops, in turn, repel counterattacks and essentially cross the highway, control the highway. Already here we see an interesting piece of information, because it looks like the Russians bypassed Khromovo, that they actually cut the road, this important road that passes through Khromovo, the one I've discussed in my previous two videos, from a location somewhere to the west of Khromovo, which suggests, by the way, that any Ukrainian force holding out in Khromovo itself is also cut off from the bulk of the Ukrainian forces to the west. But anyway, that's what Boris Rozhin says. If others have more information, I'd be delighted to hear it. Anyway, Rozhin continues. Khromovo, Bogdanovka, and Oreho-Vasilyevka continue to be under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. The supply of the group in Bakhmut itself, let me say, of course, he doesn't call it Bakhmut, but I am calling it that for the purpose of this program, goes along dirt roads and fields between Khromovo and Ivanivsky. I have discussed this many times, the fact that particularly now, with the difficult weather, the constant rain, the mud, the idea of using dirt roads and open fields to transport munitions and supplies, including food supplies, and the various other things that the troops need in order to sustain fighting on the battlefield. To my mind, that is not only misconceived, but borderline criminal. It will expose whoever is trying to affect that resupply to enormous losses. And Rogin then goes on to say that the road through Ivanivskaya remains shot through. So in other words, that road is inaccessible. And then Rogin goes on to say, in Bakhmut, Wagner continues to clean up methodically the various districts, pushing the Ukrainian troops to the area with the high-rise buildings on the very outskirts, The Ukrainian troops are suffering heavy losses in Bakhmut and to the west of it, up to 300 to 400 people per day, and a large amount of equipment. Now, I mentioned, that's what he says about the fighting, as I said, in Bakhmut. And on the question of Wagner having captured more areas in Bakhmut, we now have confirmation of that from the Russian Defense Ministry. I say confirmation. The pattern from the Russian Defense Ministry, as I've noticed for some time, is that when they say that some particular locality has been captured by the Russian troops, it invariably has been. On that, at least, they have been consistently accurate. So I take this information from the Russian Defense Ministry as correct. And what they say, and I'm taking this from TASS now, Russian assault teams liberated 2 areas in Bakhmut. Again, of course, the Russian Defense Ministry calls it Artyomsk over the past day. Spokesman for the Russian Defense Ministry, Lieutenant General Igor Konashenkov, reported on Sunday. In the Donetsk direction, assault teams liberated 2 areas in the western parts of the city of Bakhmut in the past 24 hours. The Russian airborne force units rendered support to the assault teams in the northern and southern districts of the city. Now, I'm just going to mention here a convention that the Russian Ministry of Defense usually follows. They refer to the Wagner organization as the assault teams. They avoid referencing it specifically by name. And in fact, it's been explained to me that there is actually a reason for this, and that is that apparently Russian law prohibits the existence of a private military company engaged in the kind of activities that Wagner is engaged in. So for that reason, the Russian Ministry of Defense and other state entities in Russia approach the topic of the Wagner organization and of what it does rather gingerly. I suspect this is a difficult thing for the people in the Wagner organization themselves to accept. And on that topic, we've now learned that the son of Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has served and apparently is still serving in the Wagner organization. So that gives one an idea of how even top officials in the Kremlin, their children actually participate in the fighting in Donbass as members of the Wagner organization. Anyway, it must be irritating for the people in the Wagner organization to accept this and the fact that the Russian Defense Ministry has to resorts to these euphemisms, assault forces, when they actually, of course, mean the Wagner organization. But I've been told that this is the explanation for this. This is from various people in Russia. Anyway, there it is. There have been tensions, as we know, between the Russian Defense Ministry and the Wagner organization. There have been fierce verbal quarrels between Prigozhin and senior officials in the general staff. some time ago, as I speculated, somebody came and knocked people's heads together, and the Wagner organization and the defense ministry now seem to be working as a team. I speculated in a video that this person was none other than Vladimir Putin himself, and sure enough, short time later, one of the leaks from the Pentagon included a document that claimed that it was indeed Putin, and that he supposedly met and mediated a meeting between Prigozhin and Shoigu, the defense minister, sometime in February. Well, as I said, it's not difficult to work that out or to guess it. I'm sure it's true, but as I said, it doesn't require deep intelligence or deep insight or penetration of the Russian political and military leadership to work something like that out, and even to calculate with some margin of error roughly the day when it probably happened. Anyway, I'm not going to discuss any of that further. Now, the other thing I wanted to say is that I mentioned in connection with Boris Rozhin's commentaries about, using the open fields and the tracks, the dirt tracks, to keep the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut supplied. I said that, to my mind, doing that was all but criminal, given that trying to do such a thing would expose the soldiers who were engaged in this resupply operation to quite unacceptable levels of danger. And perhaps that accounts for this comment from Prigozhin, which I want to stress I would take with a mountain of salt. He has claimed that revolts have begun amongst the servicemen of the Ukrainian armed forces in Chasov Yar and Konstantinovka. They are dropping their arms, rising and leaving. And Prigozhin also said that, according to his information, and one wonders where he gets this information, President Zelenskyy has told General Syrskyi, that's the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, that Ukraine must cling on to the last remnant of Bakhmut, which is still under its control, up to the 9th of May, when Russia celebrates its victory over Germany in the Second World War, and that this has been done in order to prevent a big informational victory for Russia. Now, this is all what Prigozhin is saying. Now, again, I want to stress, I don't know where Prigozhin is getting this information from. I presume that the Wagner people do have access to intelligence, and that this intelligence does come from the Russian Defense Ministry and its various intelligence gathering agencies, and it's not improbable that Wagner itself has some kind of an intelligence agency of its own, monitoring perhaps Ukrainian communications, that kind of thing. That doesn't mean that what Prigozhin is saying about Ukrainian troops putting down their arms and refusing to go into battle, and in fact turning round and leaving, is true. It may not be true. Even if Prigozhin is getting that intelligence, it doesn't necessarily mean that he is right. What I will say about it is this: there have been incidents, apparently, at various points in the war, when Ukrainian military units have apparently refused orders requiring them to go into battle. This is not unheard of. And there are also reports that there has been an uptick of protests across Ukraine from relatives of the soldiers who are fighting on the battlefronts, complaining about the very difficult situation in which their menfolk find themselves, about Ukraine's heavy losses. And in fact, there's been more and more pictures, some of which, by the way, are starting to appear in the Western media, about these Ukrainian cemeteries with these armies of Ukrainian flags flying over the graves of dead Ukrainian soldiers. So, whilst I've no idea where Prigozhin gets this information, it's not inconceivable that he is right. I have to say that the prospects of survival for a Ukrainian soldier involved in the shipment of supplies to what's left of the garrison in Bakhmut across these dirt roads and open fields must be, well, they must be very, very bleak. And of course the same applies to Ukrainian soldiers fighting in Bakhmut itself. In fact, a few weeks ago, I remember a Ukrainian soldier actually saying that the average life expectancy of a Ukrainian soldier fighting in Bakhmut was around 4 days. Now, that was one soldier, as I said at the time. We don't know, I can't say where he got that information from. It may be wrong, but it does seem as if the losses that the Ukrainians are suffering in Bakhmut are horrendous. And no doubt it is these losses and the problems of supply that explain why the Wagner forces are able to keep advancing, taking 2 or 3 blocks at a time on any particular day. Now, as for Prigozhin's other claim that Zelenskyy has ordered Zelenskyy to hold on to Bakhmut until beyond after the 9th of May, I make a number of observations about that. The first is to repeat the one that I made before. Where did Prigozhin get this information from? Again, that has to make one skeptical about this claim. The second, however, is that unfortunately it would not surprise me if this claim were true. On numerous occasions, Ukrainian officials, including senior Ukrainian officials, have allowed dates to dictate the course of their actions on the battlefields. I remember, for example, that during the fighting in Donbass in the summer of 2014, President Poroshenko was pushing the Ukrainian forces into what turned out to be very ill-advised offensives, which ended disastrously because, as even the Western media at that time were reporting, he was anxious to gain control of Donbass before Ukraine's Independence Day at the end of August. So it's not impossible, it would not be unprecedented if Zelenskyy did give this sort of order. If he has done so, and I want to stress again, we only have Prigozhin's word up to this point that he has. If he has given that order, then I think Zelenskyy is acting once more in an appalling way. And I think that this is completely misconceived. I mean, it would be a disastrous thing to ask men to sacrifice their lives, to cling on to an unsustainable position in order to deprive the other side, that is to say the Russians, of some sort of minor propaganda blip or triumph on a particular date. I've never seen, by the way, I should add in parenthesis, the Russians ever act on their part in that sort of way. So I just wanted to say that about this comment of Prigozhin's. One last point about this comment is that, of course, if, and again it's a big if, Zelenskyy really did say this to Syrskyi, then it seems that Zelenskyy has accepted the fact that Bakhmut will be captured by the Russians, because why else would he want to postpone that event until after the 9th of May? But again, just to repeat, we only have Prigozhin's word that Zelenskyy actually said this. Well, there we go. Now, that's what's been going on in Bakhmut. Other commentators, notably Big Serge, an individual about whom I know absolutely nothing. He is essentially a Twitter name, and I believe, and he writes long, very interesting pieces on Substack, with which sometimes, by the way, especially on his World War II accounts, well, I have one or two odd disagreements, though I'm not going to go into them in any detail here. But anyway, Big Serge certainly seems an interesting and well-informed commentator, but who he is, I have absolutely no idea. For the record, I sense that he's probably based in the United States, but I may be entirely wrong about that. The only thing I can say about him is that he clearly speaks Russian and is an Orthodox Christian. But other than that, I'm not able to say. Anyway, Big Serge has discussed the state of the fighting in the Kreminna Svatovo area, and this is on Twitter, and he says that the fighting there is every bit as intense as the fighting in Bakhmut, and Ukrainian losses in this area, particularly in the forested area, where the Russians have been very much on the offensive and have been gradually clearing these forested areas of Ukrainian troops, that Ukrainian losses in this area are comparable to their losses in Bakhmut. And he suggests that the fighting in the Svatovo Kreminna area has, by Russian choice, evolved into a similar type of meat grinder for the Ukrainian army that we are seeing in Bakhmut. In other words, the Russians are deploying what on the surface appear to be lightly armed infantry in this part of the battlefront, specifically paratroopers, though these are, again, like the Wagner forces, very highly trained troops. This has led the Ukrainians, perhaps, to think that they might have an advantage in holding these forces back, or even pushing them back, these lightly armed light infantry troops. Except that whenever the Ukrainians do that, what happens is that they immediately find themselves exposed to massive Russian artillery fire, which has the effect of inflicting exceptionally heavy losses on the Ukrainians, in exactly repeating what has been going on in Bakhmut. And as the Ukrainians take these losses, and Big Serge says that they're losing between 300 and 400 men a day, dead and wounded, in the Kreminna, in other words, roughly the same that they're losing in Bakhmut. As the Ukrainians suffer these losses, the Russians are able to push forward further. Now, this is what Big Serge is saying. I've seen various other commentators, especially Russian commentators, who say essentially the same thing, and who also say that, as in the case of Bakhmut, one consequence of the fighting in the Svatovo Kreminna area is that this Russian meat grinder tactic is having the effect of forcing Ukraine to commit ever more of its reserves into holding the line and repelling the Russian advances in the Svatovo-Kremenna area. In other words, again repeating exactly the pattern of the fighting in Bakhmut. And the objective is to weaken overall Ukraine's military, to inflict extremely heavy losses upon it. This is more important than actually capturing territory at any kind of speed. And we were told some weeks ago by Prigozhin that this was the strategy that General Surovikin basically worked out after the Battle of Popasnaya last summer, and which he discussed and agreed with Prigozhin on the eve of the Battle of Bakhmut. And it would not surprise me if, again, Surovikin is behind this approach in the Svatovo-Kremenna area, assuming that this is indeed the Russian tactic there. Now, again, I want to stress I don't have complete information about this. As I said, I'm relying heavily here on what Big Serge is saying, but it is consistent, as I said, with other things that I've read from other commentators. Now, as well as the fighting in the Svatovo-Kremenna area, there has been more Russian missile attacks and drone attacks and bombing raids on various Ukrainian positions. The Russians a few days ago claimed that they'd actually bombed Ukraine's operational headquarters, the Ukrainian army's operational headquarters in Konstantinovka, which is the headquarters that controls the Ukrainian troops that are fighting in Bakhmut, and they claim to have destroyed various ammunition and other places in places like Odessa. And every single day we read reports from the Russians about Ukrainian tanks being destroyed here and there, and guns being destroyed here and there. And that seems to be the constant story. I can't independently verify any of this. Sometimes dribbles of confirmation appear in the Western media. I'm sure overall that this does provide an accurate pattern of what is going on, but I will say no more about it, at least not in this program. Now, even as all of this is going on, there have been yet more reports that Ukraine's spring offensive has been postponed to the summer, and we don't yet know what point in the summer, but that article in which I said that Ukraine feels very aggrieved that it has not been provided with the equipment, the tanks, the infantry fighting vehicles, and above all the ammunition that it expected in order to conduct this offensive. That article, which I thought might have been in the New York Times, I now remember it was actually in Foreign Affairs, another one of these US establishment articles that cover foreign policy in all sorts of ways. And I think this may be true. I think this claim may be true. Though I would say, of course, that the Russian military, they will no doubt be aware of this. They will probably guess that this is probably correct, but I doubt that this is going to make them slip their guard. And I'm going to just say a few things about this spring offensive that we've been hearing so much about from Ukraine for such a long time. Now, here I'm going to make a point which I've actually made once before in an earlier video that I published some weeks ago, which is that the first time I heard about the idea, or rather read about the idea of a Ukrainian offensive, cutting the land bridge between Russia and Crimea. The first time I heard about such an offensive by Ukraine from Zaporozhye region, aiming perhaps for Melitopol, was in, I'm guessing around October. And I recall reading it in Slavyangrad, and again, to the best of my recollection, and I'm speaking now purely from recollection, I think the person who discussed all of this some length and saying that this was the real Ukrainian offensive, that the offensives in Kharkiv region and in Kherson region were basically warm-ups for this real Ukrainian offensive. I think it was no less a person than Gleb Bazov, a Canadian-based lawyer who was born, I believe, in Mariupol, or at least who lived there for some time, so he's a native of Donbass, very strongly pro-Russian, as I said many times, but whom I have consistently followed. I remember following him back in 2014 when he was writing about the conflict, then the fighting in Ukraine at that time, in 2014. I found him by far the most reliable commentator about the war, even more reliable at that time than Boris Rogin, by the way. And I would say that he has always struck me as both reliable and very insightful about the course of the war. Now, let's just take a step back and think about that, what that means, because as I remember from that article that I read then, that article spoke about the Ukrainian offensive in Zaporozhye to cut the land bridge as something that had been floating around conceptually in Ukraine for some time. In other words, October wasn't the first time that the Russians had become aware of this plan. And that is confirmed by what Surovikin said, also in October, when he took over as theatre commander and gave an interview to Russian television. He spoke about the fact that he would fortify the Russian lines and build up a reserve and grind the Ukrainians down. And sure enough, he did fortify the lines. And the place where he fortified them most heavily was in Zaporozhye region, in Kherson region, and in the Kreminna Svatovo area. But notice that the first of those regions, Zaporozhye, Kherson, in the south, in other words, is precisely the area where Ukraine was intending to launch it has been mooted as most likely to launch its perhaps postponed spring offensive. So all of this points to a number of things. Firstly, that this offensive has been planned a long time ago, perhaps as far back as the summer of last year, or at least has been in the works for that long. And of course that the Russians got wind of it very quickly after the idea of it first formed. Now let's take a step back and think what that means. And I'm going to suggest now that this might explain some of the very curious events that we have seen over the last few months. And I'm going to say, first of all, that everything that I'm going to say now depends entirely on speculation and an analysis, if you like. None of this is confirmed, as I've said many times. The Ukrainian General Staff, the Russian General Staff, the Pentagon, they do not share their plans or their ideas with me. I have no source in any one of these organizations. But, let's engage in some, shall we say, thinking based on the known facts, which, as I said, that this idea, this fact, this project of a Ukrainian counteroffensive in the Zaporozhye region intended to break through to the Sea of Azov, to cut the land bridge, that's been around since at least the mid-autumn and probably before that. I'm going to make a suggestion. I think that the original plan worked out by Ukraine, probably with the assistance of the US, probably with the assistance of the Pentagon, including the Joint Chiefs, was as follows. And that is that there would be these offensives, first Kharkiv, then Kherson, and then Zaporozhye, and that they were all expected to happen quickly, sequentially, one after the other. So first, the Ukrainians would launch this offensive in Kharkiv region. US intelligence had picked up the fact that Russian forces in this area were extremely weak, very, very few in number. So it would be possible, I think, or that was the assumption, it would be possible for the Ukrainians to make very rapid advances in Kharkiv region, which of course they did do. And then there would be, in parallel with that advance, an equally fast, blistering advance towards Kherson city, trapping 25,000 Russian troops west of the Dnieper River. The assumption very much was that the Russians would not wish to give up Kherson city, so you'd shell the bridge, the Antonovsky Bridge, cut off this Russian forces' prospects of resupply, encircle it, defeat it, and then directly afterwards, once these two offensives had happened, you'd attack in Zaporozhye. And the plan, I think that was the original plan, and it was based very much on an assessment of the state of the Russian forces in the summer of 2022. Now we know that in the summer of 2022, the Russian forces, which were engaged in this war, had lost a very substantial number of their troops, because in August, the soldiers on 6-month contracts, the professional soldiers on 6-month contracts, their contracts expired, and a very substantial number of them went home. And of course, the Russians undoubtedly did suffer losses in the intervening fighting. And anyway, the fact was that by late August 2022, the Russian forces were significantly reduced in number from what they had been at the start of the special military operation in February and March. So, and of course at that time, we're talking about the summer of 2022, there were none of these fortifications that we see in all of these places at the present time. So it's possible to see how planners in the Pentagon, and perhaps in London, if they were involved, which they probably were, and in Brussels at NATO level, and conceivably in Kiev, I mean, they would have played some sort of a role, presumably. It's easy to see how it might have seemed to them that with Ukraine now possessing a very significant numerical superiority as Ukraine's mobilization processes have brought in very large numbers of troops into the Ukrainian military, and with Ukraine possessing its HIMARS missiles and its M777 howitzers and all those things, it's easy to see how there might have been hopes, perhaps even expectations, that these offensives would each, one after the other, achieve rapid success. Well, it went wrong. Firstly, the Kharkiv offensive failed to achieve its full objective. Yes, Balakleya and Izium and Kupiansk were captured, but the Ukrainians were very significantly slowed down at Krasny Liman. It took them weeks to capture this small town, despite the fact that the garrison that was defending it numbered no more than 500 men. And the Russians were able to reinforce. And the key objective of that offensive, reaching Svatovo and Kreminna, with the hope of cutting off Russian supply lines to the Donbass group, that offensive, that objective was not realized. Whether realizing that objective would have had quite the dramatic consequences that the Pentagon and the others might have hoped is another matter. I was skeptical at the time, I'm skeptical today, but anyway, let's put that aside. Clearly, it was the plan. That was what the Ukrainians at the time were seeking to do. Likewise, the Kherson offensive, on the one hand, proceeded far more slowly than expected, and instead of the Russians letting themselves be cut off on the west bank of the Dnieper, they simply pulled back and consolidated on the east bank. And that seems to me to have been, again, something that perhaps in the West, in Kiev, in Brussels, in Washington, in London, was unexpected. And I'm going to add that the other thing that happened, which was probably also unexpected, was that the Ukrainian forces suffered enormously heavy losses in both of these offensives. Much, much heavier losses than had been anticipated. So that after these two offensives were concluded, the Kharkov offensive and the Kherson offensive, neither of which achieved its key strategic objective. The Ukrainian military was simply in no condition to launch the main offensive towards the Sea of Azov from Zaporozhye, which had been originally planned. And that upset both the planning and the timetable. I'm assuming that the Zaporozhye offensive was expected to take place in the autumn of 2022, directly after the Kharkov and Kherson offensive, at a time when it would have been assumed that the Russians would be in chaos and reeling from the two punches that had been delivered at them. And when that proved impossible, the question then arose whether to continue with it or to do something else. Now, that, I would suggest, explains much about what has happened over the last few weeks, few months, in fact. Because ever since the Ukrainian offensives of the autumn stalled, came to an end, there's been this debate in the West about whether to go on the offensive, whether Ukraine should go on the offensive, should continue with the Zaporozhye offensive or not. And of course, the Zaporozhye offensive, if my thinking is correct, was planned for a different time and a different set of circumstances. to the one that exists today. As I said, it was discussed, it was being thought about at least from October, almost certainly from well before. It assumed a small, weakened, demoralized Russian army on the run. What it has instead is a massively reinforced, re-equipped Russian army, which has been making significant inroads in Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Svatovo, Kreminna, all of those places. That has hundreds of thousands of additional troops as a result of the call-up that took place in September, and which now has heavy fortified lines, which it can use to shield itself and to block any Ukrainian advances. So understandably, there's been agonizing debate about what to do, whether to press on, whether to press ahead with an offensive towards the Sea of Azov, which had been planned for a completely different situation, or whether to call off the entire idea of the offensive entirely. And I get the sense that the argument has gone backwards and forwards ever since. So back in January, we had General Milley, who of course would have been involved in all of this planning. He was talking at that time, after the Ukrainian offensives had run their course, he was talking about starting negotiations. And then soon after that, we got the report from the Rand Corporation, which said that it would not be in the US interest to conduct a prolonged war, and that Ukraine's ability to defeat Russia was diminishing, and that its ability to do that anyway was unrealistic. And that we had other reports from the CSIS at that time talking about the depleted level of US arsenals. Of course, if the expectation was that the knockout blow would be dealt in the autumn, the question of depleted arsenals would not have arisen. There wouldn't have been the concern there is today about the ammunition shortages, because these did not exist, that problem did not exist, or was not anticipated to exist in the summer and autumn of last year. Well, the CSIS started to flash warning lights about depleted US arsenals. The IMF came back and said that the Russian economy had weathered the sanctions storm. It was unlikely to implode. On the contrary, it was more likely to achieve growth this year and next year, by the way, as well. So we got all those arguments, and then we got the pushback, all the hardliners saying, well, we can't give up now. Russia is still obviously on the back foot. We must press on with this offensive. Failing to do so would be a betrayal of Ukraine. So then we got the pendulum swing at the Ramstein meeting in January with a decision to try and beef up this Ukrainian offensive in Zaporozhye, with these, by my calculations, 26,000 troops that have received some degree of training in Britain and in the European Union, and beefed up with a couple of score tanks, Western tanks, around 60 of them, by the way. And so it's swung backwards and forwards ever since then, with some people saying, let's go for it, it might still work, and others more sceptical. And that, I suspect, explains much of the toing and froing about all of this. Nobody in the West was expecting that we would be that Ukraine would be in the position that it is in today. It was expected that Ukraine would probably win the war in the autumn, that Ukraine would fail to do so, has left planning in some disarray, and of course the attempts to equip Ukraine to conduct a successful offensive in Zaporozhye region against fortified Russian lines, and a re-equipped and reinforced Russian army, fully aware of Ukraine's plans, is now meeting with some skepticism. Anyway, the fact that it is meeting with skepticism and that there are growing doubts about it is confirmed in the oddest of places, and that is in an article by my old friend Simon Tisdall, the foreign international news editor, as I understand it, of The Guardian, and he now has what is for him deeply pessimistic article about the state of the war in Ukraine. It says, truce or a bloody stalemate, it all rides on Ukraine's spring offensive. And Zelenskyy may be forced to accept an unpalatable compromise, however well his troops do on the battlefield. And he goes on to say, Simon Tisdall, a person who has been one of Ukraine's most fervid supporters, one who has demanded the maximum support for Ukraine, up to and including the declaration by the West of a no-fly zone, one who has consistently supported President Zelenskyy's maximalist demands. Anyway, this is some of the things in this long article that Simon Tisdall says. This is how the war ends. Ukraine's long-awaited spring counteroffensive succeeds in recapturing some or even lots of occupied territory. But Russia's more numerous forces, dug in behind minefields, tank traps and dragon's teeth, remain in control of parts of the Donbass and Crimea. As autumn begins, it's plain there's to be no clean sweep. Amid huge destruction, big Russian losses, critical Ukrainian manpower, weapons and equipment shortages, and waning appetites for an endless war of attrition, Kiev's Western backers begin to push for a negotiated ceasefire or durable peace pending a longer-term settlement. China gets in on the act too. Whilst maintaining its claim to 4 regions illegally annexed last year, Russia eventually agrees a conditional ceasefire. Putin hails the strategic neutralization of Ukraine. President Zelenskyy is obliged to temporarily postpone his drive to restore his country's pre-2014 borders. In return, Ukraine is spared further unsustainable human, economic and infrastructure losses whilst retaining roughly 85% of its territory. An internationally monitored Korean-style demilitarized zone freezes front lines in place. The missiles stop coming, rebuilding can begin, refugees come home. And the US and its West European NATO allies declare that democratic Ukraine's sovereign independence and the global rules-based order are saved. Poland and other East European states are less sure. Ukraine's EU accession is dangled anew. NATO membership will be trickier, as a Berlin-Brussels spat indicated last week. The final settlement peace process may take years. Renewed conflict will be a constant fear. If this scenario or something like it transpires over the next year, many Ukrainians will feel betrayed. President Biden's pledge to do whatever it takes to repel Russia will go unfulfilled. Putin will survive in power despite his many atrocious crimes. Now, actually, some of us reading what this outcome that Tisdall is describing might take the view that actually it's an outcome not unfavourable to Ukraine. They're left with 85% of their pre-2014 territory and they're able to start reconstructing. Well, they would at the very least have survived and they would have a future as a country. But apparently it doesn't suit maximalists like Tisdall, but he's starting to get grudgingly round to the likelihood that the maximalist objectives that he's been dangling out are unachievable. He admits that there's growing demands from all sorts of people in the West, and it's interesting that the people he quotes whose demand for this are predominantly Americans, in fact almost entirely Americans, that that the need to bring the war to an end quickly is growing, that there is grudging acceptance that endless war in Ukraine is not working at all in Ukraine's favour. He quotes, for example, Stephen Walt, a well-informed observer from Harvard, as saying, as much as we'd all like to see the swift liberation of Ukrainian territory, a spring offensive is unlikely to make far-reaching gains. I suspect most top officials in the Biden administration understand this cruel reality, whatever they may say in public. Instead, they're hoping Ukraine's armed forces do well enough to convince Putin to move towards a ceasefire and eventually negotiate a full peace settlement. We'll come to that in a moment. He then mentions, as I've done previously, that Ben Wallace, the British Defence Minister, one of the most fervid supporters of Ukraine, has started to speak about the prospects in more realistic terms. And Tisdall himself says it's clear Ukraine's leaders have but a few months in which to beat the Russians back before so far largely tacit but growing international pressure to open negotiations, whether they want them or not, becomes overt and potentially irresistible. Presumably Putin knows this. It affords him an added incentive not to give ground. And then he finishes by saying, so everything rides on the coming offensive, already dubbed Ukraine's longest day. It could determine the country's long-term relationship with both East and West. For now, Zelenskyy, backed by 64% of Ukrainians, which already significant fall, by the way, but never mind, is sticking in public at least to his maximalist position that every last inch of occupied territory be liberated. Yet even as his troops move into position, Zelenskyy is surely aware of the rear echelon second-guessing and political calculation that is going on between allies behind his back. To end their pain and suffering, Ukrainians may soon be asked to swallow a very bitter pill. Well, as I've said, if this is the outcome, if it all ends with the kind of outcome that Simon Tisdall is talking about, if Ukraine's offensive does regain some territory but fails to regain all of it, and we have a provisional agreement on this kind of basis, what we would have ended up with is something that is, in essence, very little different from the proposal Ukraine itself made in March 2022 in Istanbul, which the Russians indicated that they were prepared to accept, but which Ukraine, on Western advice, went back on. So I can see why, from Tisdall's perspective, this would be a failure. My own view is that Tisdall is being over-optimistic here. Let's say that this offensive takes place. Let's say that it does gain some ground. I'm not sure that it will, but let's say that it does. Tisdall already admits that in such a situation, Ukraine will have suffered severe losses. It's running out of men. That's his words. I mean, he talks about manpower shortages, ammunition shortages, all of those things. Whereas one gets the sense that the Russians are getting stronger all the time. Their defense industries are churning out more and more shells, more and more tanks, more and more missiles, more and more guided bombs, all of those things. Why should the Russians accept these proposals? Why would the Russians accept these proposals now? They're dealing with a weakened Ukraine. Even as they're getting stronger, would it not make more sense for the Russians to stick to their maximalist positions, which is to say that yes, we're prepared to negotiate a ceasefire, but first Ukraine must evacuate the entire territory of the 4 regions. After all, by Tisdale's own admission, Ukraine will have come under enormous pressure from the Western powers at that point, having failed to achieve the objectives of its offensive. It would be under enormous pressure from the Western powers to negotiate and to compromise. Would the Russians not see that as a sign of weakness? Would they not say, well, we've made our position, our constitution doesn't allow us to accept ceasefires, which might result in territories which we claim to be our own, to be under enemy occupation indefinitely? As I said, what would be the incentive on the Russians to negotiate? Maybe the Chinese and the Indians might be enlisted to try to put pressure on the Russians to water down their demands. But they've not shown any interest in putting any pressure on the Russians up to this point, and specifically in the case of China, I get the impression that Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership value the relationship with Russia far too highly to complicate it by trying to force the Russians into a premature peace, what the Russians would see as a premature peace. So, already I can see fundamental problems, even in this worst case scenario that Tisdale is talking about. There is, however, another possibility. Obviously, the first possibility is, Ukraine achieves all its objectives. It does what Ben Hodges, that the US general I was talking about yesterday, says. It breaks through all the way to the Sea of Azov. It isolates Crimea. Russia panics. Putin is overthrown. All of these things which Tisdale himself admits most people in the West no longer expects. The second possibility is this outcome that Tisdale is talking about, where Ukraine captures a small amount of territory, 30 kilometers have some suggested, or perhaps even more than that, but is left so gravely weakened, and with its allies in the West, with their arsenal so severely depleted, that they can't support Ukraine any longer, that they press Ukraine into negotiations. What about the third possibility? What about the possibility that the offensive fails? I mean, I don't know that it will. When I say fails, I mean fails entirely. We're already being told now, and there's more and more people who are saying this, including people on the Russian side, that Ukraine can only succeed, its only chance in this offensive, given the ammunition shortages, the tank shortages, the equipment shortages, the incomplete training and preparation of the troops, the lack of air cover, the strengthening Russian forces. The only prospects of success are a Ukrainian breakthrough, if not in the first 24 hours, that might be expecting and demanding altogether too much, at least, shall we say, in the first few weeks. But let's say that that fails to happen. Let's say that the Ukrainian offensive is repelled. After all, they didn't break through. They failed to break through in Kherson region. They stumbled when they needed to take Krasny Liman. There have been various Ukrainian counterattacks over the last few weeks. Pushilin was talking about them yesterday, and they've all been unsuccessful. What if this offensive fails? They never achieved a breakthrough in Kherson region, and there were no fortifications to speak of there, and the Russian forces were far fewer, and they were principally, light infantry, airborne troops, paratroopers backed by artillery, and light aircraft, helicopters, attack helicopters, and ground attack aircraft. And even then, they were able to hold the Ukrainians back for weeks and inflict extremely heavy casualties upon them. So, what if the Ukrainian offensive fails? What if Ukraine throws its forces against these prepared Russian defenses, and the offensive is repelled, and Ukraine suffers very, very heavy losses? Why, in that case, would the Russians be interested in negotiating with Ukraine? Is it not more plausible in that case that they will do what there are increasing hints that they are planning to do, which is to launch a counteroffensive of their own, taking advantage of the losses Ukraine suffered in order to press home their advantage? In which case, Ukraine's negotiating position will be much weaker. Now, I've gone through all of these scenarios in order to suggest again, I've said this so many times now, but to suggest again that a realist thinker, somebody who understands how problematic this offensive has become. As I said, my speculation is that it was planned for last autumn. It's much more difficult to carry it through successfully now. My view is, and has always been, that from a realist point of view, the only one that one should ever follow, an objective point of view, if you prefer, Ukraine's bargaining position, if it wants to initiate negotiations, is better now than it is most likely to be once this offensive has run its course. If Tisdall is right, and a negotiation is now the probable outcome of this war, then on every objective calculus, Ukraine's bargaining position today is stronger than it is likely to be when the offensive has either been repelled or has achieved only limited gains. Now, I say all of this, I don't expect anybody, either in Kiev or amongst the leadership of the West, now utterly committed to this war, and I mean by that the leadership in Washington, to accept this logic. What they're going to do instead, and about this I have no doubt, is that they're going to gamble everything on this last card, exactly as Tisdall says, with the likely prospect that Ukraine will suffer horrific losses and be left in a weaker position, or perhaps in a disastrous position. Well, we shall see how things turn out. I'm going to finish this program by a quick comment about the situation in Sudan. This is not so much about the situation in Sudan. It's been provoked by two articles, one by the international affairs analyst Andrei Karibko, and the other by the inestimable Larry Johnson at Sonar 21. He is someone whom I've often talked about many times on these programs. He's one of the most acute and insightful commentators about this Ukraine war, or indeed on almost any subject that I can think of. Anyway, let's deal with Karibka first. Now, Karibka, I should say, and I have had historic dealings. We've not been in touch very much recently for all sorts of reasons, none of which, there's never been any issues between us. Anyway, I just wanted to say that Karibka writes extensively on foreign policy. He wrote some years ago articles on the Duran's website to the effect that India seemed to be distancing itself from BRICS and was moving into a strategic alliance with the United States against China and Russia. I was skeptical about that at the time, and I think events have vindicated me. On the other hand, Karibka also said that Saudi Arabia and Turkey seemed to be distancing themselves from the West, were on a trajectory of distancing themselves from the West. I remember him writing all about this years ago. I was openly skeptical on that issue, on those issues. He was right and I was wrong. I just wanted to say that. So Karibko is absolutely someone to take very seriously. And Karibko has been saying, and about this, there is no doubt that over the last few days, there has been a sustained campaign in the West to try to talk up Russian responsibility for the conflict in Sudan. Supposedly, the conflict in Sudan is all the fault of the Russians. They allegedly have egged on this militia to attack the Sudanese army. Well, there is no doubt at all that this narrative has been circulating over the last couple of days, and I was going to do a video to refute it, but Larry Johnson has beaten me to the post. He has done a brilliant article pointing out the utter absurdity of this idea. After all, the Russians have negotiated a naval base agreement with the Sudanese government, and they are fully preoccupied, as Larry Johnson says, with their special military operation in Ukraine. Why would they therefore want conflict in Sudan? Surely their interest is maintaining peace in Sudan so that they can get their naval base and have less to worry about as they focus on Ukraine. Larry Johnson's comment on this is a model of good sense. And if you want a clear refutation of this whole narrative of Russian responsibility for the Sudan war, all I can suggest is go to his article on Sonar 21, Larry Johnson's article, Sonar 21, and you'll find it all there. Well, that's me for the day. A long, somewhat discursive video. Apologies for that, for anyone who's a little bit dismayed by the length of this video. More from me soon, and all that remains is for me to wish you a very good day, to remind you that all our programs can be found on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop with all its wonderful things, its magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, If you've liked this long video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today, and a very good day, and see you all soon.